The second gallery of the timeline begins with the mid-1800s. And at this point, the sewing machine is really taking off. And you can see the scale of the skirts and the dresses in general become larger and larger as it's easier to make these large seams. One of the implications is that the trimmings are increasingly done with the self fabric or a matching fabric that is pleated or ruffled or gathered into these extensive trimmings. The lengths of these seams is facilitated by the ease of mechanized sewing. Another technological innovation of the mid-19th century was the invention of synthetic dyes. The young William Perkins was 18 years old when he had a science experiment that went a little bit awry, and he realized that everything turned purple. This ultimately proved to be quite fortuitous as he realized that this was a viable synthetic dye. While the first dye was purple, known as mauvine, ultimately, as the century progressed, they developed synthetic greens and blues. The result of all of these dyes was that the palette for fashion in the mid-19th century was extremely bold. Well, we've looked at a number of technological changes that really revolutionized fashion through the 19th century. The second half of the 19th century saw innovations in the organization of the industry. Through the early part of the century, both men and women would go and purchase the fabrics that they would bring to their dressmaker or tailor to be made into customized garments. The demands of the Civil War changed how menswear was made. In order to provide uniforms for the army, the government really supported the development of a system of standardized sizing. After the war, this innovation persisted. Department stores and mail-order catalogs, which became popular in the 1870s and 80s, sold clothes for men, which was available in pre-made sizes. This innovation, however, was not really available for women. Because of the complexity of the cut and fit of women's clothing, they continued to be custom made through the end of the 19th century. The department stores and mail-order catalogs, however, did have many offerings for women. They sold textiles, but they also sold capes, wraps, shawls, and other loose-fitting outerwear that didn't demand a fit. The introduction of department stores and mail-order catalogs democratized the availability of fashion. One of the questions that I get most often when I give a tour of the fashion timeline is, what did ordinary people wear? And in fact, the pieces that are on view really were those of middle-class Americans. People would have spent more proportionally on individual clothing items than we do today, and they simply would have had fewer of them. One of the ideas we have about 19th century clothing is that there were different garments for each time of day and different activity. There'd be a morning dress and an afternoon dress and a walking suit, and then something for receptions and for a ball. And the demands of having this many different garments was really not available for the vast swath of the population. So when we think about ordinary people, they wouldn't necessarily have this many outfits. One way that they could make their wardrobe go further was to have a single skirt that matched multiple bodices. For instance, they'll have a skirt that will go with a reception bodice as well as one for a ball. Another reaction that I often get from the public about this exhibition is they wonder whether people were really that small. And one of the things that's really great about the way the timeline is presented is that the pieces are right on the floor, so you can really get a perspective and see how tall people were. While it's true that people were probably smaller back then, owing to changes in availability of food and medicine, another explanation for the survival of these small pieces is that they wouldn't have been very useful to later generations as they tried to play dress up or remake the garments. Their small size would have made them less useful to reuse and thus would have ensured their survival. Women's fashions of the late 19th century were remarkable for the extent to which they deformed and reshaped the woman's form. The fashions, particularly the 1890s, you see these enormous puffed sleeves, the very tight corsets, the skirts which went in a cone shape all the way to the floor. And then even by the turn of the century, you see the corsets are really deforming the woman's shape, thrusting her chest forward and her hips backwards in the characteristic S bend. These styles were supported not only by tight corsetry, but layers and layers of petticoats, which concealed the legs completely. By the beginning of World War I, women's fashion sees an abrupt change. The needs of women going to work and replacing men who've left for the front leads to the adoption of many elements of menswear. Women start wearing suits, you see much more tailored garments, and the skirts become shorter. The silhouette is quite changed and becomes more columnar and less of the sinuous lines of the late 19th and early 20th century.